Hey, amazing viewers, before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The night everything changed. The night was supposed to be one of the happiest in her life. Sophie clutched her hospital gown, her heart racing as she gazed at the three tiny faces nestled against her. She could barely believe it. 3 beautiful boys, their soft whimpers filling the air. Their skin, a warm, rich tone, glowed under the dim hospital lights. She traced their delicate fingers, tears slipping down her cheeks. They were perfect. But the moment she looked up and met her husband's eyes, her heart sank. Mark stood frozen at the hospital door, his jaw clenched, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive suit. His face was pale, eyes darting between Sophie and the newborns, as if he was seeing something he couldn't understand, or worse, something he didn't want to accept. What is this? His voice was barely above a whisper. Sophie swallowed hard, confused. Mark, these are our sons, our babies. His expression didn't change. He took a step closer, then stopped, shaking his head. No, Sophie, this isn't possible. She blinked, her body still weak from childbirth. What do you mean? His hands trembled as he pointed at the newborns. They're black. Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Sophie's breath hitched. She was white, and so was Mark. And yet their children's deep brown skin told a different story. The doctor had already explained it. A rare genetic trait. Somewhere deep in Sophie's ancestry, a black relative had passed down genes that had remained dormant for generations. The odds of those genes manifesting in all 3 children were incredibly slim, but not impossible. She had tried to tell Mark before he arrived, but he had ignored her calls. Now, standing there, she realized that no explanation would ever be enough. His face contorted with something dark. Betrayal, disbelief, maybe even hatred. You cheated on me, he spat. You expect me to believe this nonsense? Mark, I swear on my life, I have never been with another man. Her voice cracked, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. But he wasn't listening. He paced the hospital room like a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching. Do you think I'm stupid? My wife gives birth to triplets that don't look like me, and I'm just supposed to accept it. His voice rose. How could you do this to me? Tears blurred Sophie's vision. Mark, please. He turned suddenly, his face cold as steel. We're done. The words knocked the air from her lungs. What? You heard me. His voice was sharp, cutting through her like a blade. You can stay here with your kids, not mine, but don't ever come home. Sophie's world shattered in an instant. The next hours passed in a haze of disbelief and despair. Mark left the hospital without another word, and by morning, a nurse handed her divorce papers he had already signed. There was no discussion, no attempt at understanding, just finality. By the time she was discharged, her entire life had crumbled. Her house, gone. Mark had her name removed from their assets overnight. Their joint accounts, frozen. She had nowhere to go, no money. And now 3 helpless babies depending on her. As she stepped out of the hospital doors with nothing but a small bag of baby supplies and a heart weighed down by grief, she realized something chilling. She was homeless. A mother's struggle in the shadows. The rain was relentless. Sophie pulled her thin coat tighter around her body, shielding the 3 tiny bundles in her arms from the cold night air. The city was alive with neon lights and car horns, but in the alley where she stood, life felt still, forgotten. A week had passed since she left the hospital. A week of fear, exhaustion, and overwhelming uncertainty. Her feet ached from walking. Her arms burned from holding the triplets. But she couldn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the crushing truth. She had nowhere to go. She had knocked on every door she could think of. Friends, old college roommates, even distant family members. Some had turned her away with apologetic looks. Others hadn't even answered. She couldn't blame them. Who would take in a woman with 3 newborns and nothing to her name? The shelters were full, the few she'd managed to find. She had spent nights in hospital waiting rooms, bus stations, and even a public library, sneaking sleep between the cries of her babies. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. And now, she stood in the shadows of the city, wet, starving, and alone. A car drove by, splashing water onto the sidewalk. She barely flinched. Her body had gone numb from the cold, her thoughts running on a single instinct: keep moving. Then she saw it. A diner. The warm glow of its lights beckoned like a lighthouse in the storm. Through the window, she saw people sitting at tables, eating, laughing, living. The smell of coffee and fresh bread drifted toward her, making her stomach twist with longing. She hesitated. Then, with careful steps, she pushed the door open. The bell above jingled, and warmth wrapped around her like a long-lost embrace. The triplets stirred in her arms, one of them letting out a soft cry. Heads turned. Sophie kept her eyes down, shuffling toward a corner booth. She didn't belong here, not with her damp clothes, her matted hair, her exhausted face. But she had nowhere else to go. A waitress approached, an older woman with kind eyes. She glanced at the babies, then at Sophie. "Honey, are you all right?" Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. I just need a moment." The woman studied her for a long second, then nodded. "Stay as long as you need." She disappeared into the kitchen, and Sophie exhaled shakily. She rocked her babies gently, whispering soothing words. But inside, she was crumbling. How had her life come to this? She had been a devoted wife, a woman who had done everything right. She had loved Mark. She had trusted him. And now she was nothing more than a nameless stranger in a diner, hiding from the world. Tears burned her eyes. Then the waitress returned, placing a steaming bowl of soup and a plate of bread on the table. Sophie looked up, startled. I can't pay for this." "Don't worry about that," the woman said softly. "Eat." Sophie hesitated, then picked up the spoon. The first sip sent warmth coursing through her veins. She hadn't realized how weak she was until now. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, while her babies dozed against her chest. For the first time in days, she felt human again. Then the door opened. A man walked in, shaking off the rain from his coat. He was tall, with sharp features and a presence that made people glance up. Sophie didn't pay much attention, until he stopped, staring right at her. Her heart lurched. She knew that look. It was the same look Mark had given her in the hospital. Shock, confusion. The man took a slow step forward. "Sophie." Her breath caught. She knew that voice. It was David, her childhood friend, the boy who had once promised to protect her forever, the promise he had broken years ago. And now, here he was, standing before her, staring at the woman she had become. A glimpse of hope. A storm raged inside Sophie's chest. She had spent the past week sinking deeper into despair, convincing herself that no one from her past would ever appear, let alone him. Yet there he was, standing in the warm glow of the diner, staring at her as if she were a ghost from a life he had long forgotten. David. The boy who had once been her best friend. The boy who had once wiped her tears when she scraped her knee, who had sworn they would always have each other's backs. The boy who had disappeared from her life without a word. Sophie's fingers gripped the edge of the table, her breath unsteady. The past rushed back like a tidal wave. Long summer afternoons running through fields, sneaking into the town carnival, whispering secrets under the stars. And then, the day he left. His family had moved away. And just like that, their childhood bond had been severed. And now, after all these years, he was here. "Sophie." His voice was lower than she remembered, but the concern in his tone was unmistakable. She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. David. His eyes flickered to the sleeping triplets in her arms. She saw the confusion deepen in his expression, the way he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He stepped closer. "It's really you." Sophie nodded, her fingers trembling around the spoon she had been holding. "Yeah, it's me." David pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his eyes never leaving her face. "What happened to you?" The question cut deeper than he probably intended. What had happened to her? One moment, she had been a woman with a husband, a home, a future. And in the blink of an eye, she had been cast out, discarded like she meant nothing. She looked down at her babies. They meant everything. Sophie took a shaky breath. "It's a long story." David glanced at the waitress, who had been watching the exchange from a distance. With a nod, he signaled for her to bring 2 coffees. Sophie opened her mouth to protest. She had no money, but the waitress simply smiled and walked away. "Tell me," David said gently. "I'm listening." Sophie hesitated. For days, she had bottled everything inside, pushing back her pain to survive. But now, with someone from her past sitting across from her, the dam inside her threatened to break. She exhaled. "Mark left me." David's brows furrowed. "What? Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because of them." She nodded toward the babies. "Because they didn't look like him." David's expression darkened. "What kind of man does that?" Sophie let out a bitter laugh. "A man who never really loved me." She shook her head. "It wasn't even my fault. The doctor said it was genetics, but he didn't believe me. He threw me out the same night I gave birth." David's jaw clenched. "And he just left you homeless, with newborns." She nodded, feeling the familiar sting of tears. "I've been surviving. Barely. I have nowhere to go." Silence stretched between them. David leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His gaze softened, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Do you remember what I used to tell you when we were kids?" he asked. Sophie frowned. "What?" His lips curled into the faintest smile. "That if you ever needed me, I'd come running." A lump formed in Sophie's throat. She had buried those memories long ago, along with the foolish hope that someone would ever keep their promises. "I meant it then," David continued, his voice steady. "And I mean it now." She blinked at him, her breath catching. "David, why? I can't ask you." "You didn't ask," he interrupted. "I'm offering." Sophie searched his face, looking for hesitation, for pity, but all she saw was determination. "You and the babies are coming with me," he said firmly. "No arguments." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For so long, she had fought alone, convinced that no one would ever extend a hand to her. Now, here was David, offering something she had thought was long lost. Hope. Her lips trembled. "Why would you do this for me?" David's expression softened. "Because you're still Sophie." He glanced at the babies. "And they deserve better." Tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe. She wasn't alone anymore. A new beginning or just another storm. The sound of steady raindrops against the car window was almost hypnotic. Sophie sat in the passenger seat of David's sleek black SUV, cradling her 3 sleeping sons against her chest. It had been so long since she had been in a warm, safe space that it felt unreal. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the soft curls on one of the triplets' tiny heads. Every breath they took, every tiny sigh they let out, reminded her that despite everything, she was still their mother. She would always fight for them. But the question that haunted her mind was simple. Was this a new beginning, or just another storm waiting to destroy her? David, focused on the road, cleared his throat. "You're awfully quiet." Sophie turned to look at him. His face was mostly in shadow, the streetlights flickering against his sharp features as they passed. He had changed since the last time she had seen him. The goofy boy she once knew had been replaced by a man, one whose presence commanded attention, whose confidence was evident in everything he did. But despite the years, there was still something familiar in his eyes. The same protectiveness, the same warmth. Sophie sighed, looking down at her babies. I don't know how to feel about all of this. About you. About me suddenly being in your car, driving off tow. She hesitated. Where are we even going? David smirked. I have a house outside the city. It's quiet, safe, and has enough space for you and the boys. Sophie blinked. A house. She had been living in bus stations and barely surviving, and here he was, offering her an entire house. You live alone? She asked. Yeah. It's too big for one person, but I never got around to selling it. She could hear the unspoken words in his voice. Loneliness. Something tugged at her heart. David, why are you really doing this? He glanced at her quickly before turning his eyes back on the road. Because it's you, Sophie. And because I wish I had been there sooner. Her breath hitched. She had spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like no one cared. And here was David, proving her wrong. Minutes later, the car pulled into a long paved driveway. When Sophie looked up, her mouth nearly fell open. The house wasn't just a house, it was huge. A modern two-story home with large glass windows and warm yellow lights glowing inside. A porch wrapped around the front, and she could see the flicker of the fireplace through the living room window. This is your house, she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. David chuckled. Yeah. Why? She shook her head. I wasn't expecting this. He parked the car, then turned to face her fully. Look, Sophie, I know this might seem like too much too fast, but I need you to understand something. His expression grew serious. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. You're not some charity case. You and the boys deserve a place to be safe, to rest, to breathe. That's all I'm offering. No strings attached. Her chest ached at his words. She wasn't sure how to accept kindness anymore. Not after being abandoned by the one person who was supposed to love her the most. But this felt different. David stepped out of the car, grabbed the bags she had been carrying, and opened the passenger door for her. Come on, he said gently. With careful movements, she climbed out, cradling her babies against her. The cold air brushed against her skin, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of the night. David led her inside, flicking on the lights. Warmth. That was the first thing she felt. The house smelled like cedar wood and fresh linen. A large sectional couch sat in the living room, a fireplace crackling nearby. I set up one of the guest rooms for you, David said, leading her down a hallway. He pushed open a door, revealing a cozy bedroom with a queen-sized bed, and her breath hitched. 3 brand-new baby cribs. You? She turned to him, wide-eyed. You got cribs. David shrugged as if it was nothing. I figured the boys would need a place to sleep. Emotion swelled inside her, so overwhelming she could barely breathe. She turned away quickly, blinking back tears. David, I don't know how to thank you. He touched her shoulder lightly. Then don't. Just rest. For the first time in weeks, Sophie lay down in a real bed, her babies sleeping peacefully beside her. For the first time in weeks, she let go. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The moment that changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting a soft golden hue over the room. Sophie stirred, feeling warmth beneath her fingertips, the softness of real sheets, the steady rhythm of 3 tiny breaths beside her. For the first time in months, she had slept. Not in a bus station, not in a hospital waiting room, not curled up on a hard bench. A bed. A real bed. And for the first time in months, she didn't wake up feeling afraid. She turned, gazing at the triplets sleeping peacefully in their cribs. Their little chests rose and fell in perfect sync, their tiny hands curled into fists. A lump formed in her throat. They deserved this. A home. Stability. Love. A quiet knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She got up carefully, adjusting the oversized sweater David had given her the night before. She still wasn't used to it. The kindness, the warmth, the idea that someone was looking out for her again. She opened the door to find David standing there, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. "Morning," he said, his voice deep and husky with sleep. Sophie blinked in surprise. David drank coffee now. The boy she once knew used to hate it. But then again, the man standing before her was no longer the boy from her childhood. "Morning," she murmured, accepting the cup. They stood in silence for a moment. David leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully. "How do you feel?" he finally asked. Sophie exhaled, staring down at her coffee. How did she feel? Like a woman who had lost everything. Like a mother fighting to rebuild her life. Like someone standing at the edge of something new and terrifying. And hopeful. "I feel." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know. It's been so long since I've felt anything but fear." David nodded, as if he understood without her having to say it. "You're safe now, Sophie." The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she believed it. 1 year later, Sophie stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the front of her blazer. The reflection staring back at her was one she barely recognized. Her hair was neatly styled, her eyes no longer clouded with exhaustion. She looked alive. She turned, glancing at the triplets playing in the living room. A giggle escaped from one of them as David chased them around the couch, his expression full of the same warmth he had shown her since the day he found her. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. A knock at the door pulled her attention. She walked over, taking a deep breath before opening it. Mark stood on the other side. Sophie's heart didn't race. It didn't sink. It didn't break. She simply stared at the man who had once been her world, and then thrown her away like she was nothing. Mark's eyes darted to the triplets behind her. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked guilty, hesitant. I heard about everything," he stammered. "I made a mistake, Sophie." She crossed her arms. "You did." Mark swallowed hard. "I want to fix things. I want to see them. Be part of their lives." Sophie studied him. The man who abandoned her. The man who left her homeless. The man who didn't believe in her when she needed him the most. Then she looked over her shoulder at David, who was now on the floor, laughing as the triplets climbed all over him. One man walked away. The other stayed. Sophie turned back to Mark, her voice calm, unwavering. "They don't need you, Mark," she said. Mark's face paled. "Sophie." She held up a hand, cutting him off. "They already have a father." With that, she closed the door. And for the first time in her life, she felt free. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.